Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon-neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you for joining the conversation. Energy generation and distribution are poised for the kind of disruption that transformed many other industries over the past 20 years as digital technology changed the organization of work, retail distribution, dining, driving, and shopping, and many other things. But the electric grid is a stubbornly rigid physical infrastructure that will require vast investments to modernize. The changes that will follow the reorganization of the grid will also transform our relationship to energy as fundamentally as the introduction of electricity and power distribution lines in the late 1800s. It will be a challenge, fascinating, and sometimes terrifying time for energy companies, investors, and consumers. Our guest today is Dr. Tim Lieuwen. He is the Regents Professor, holder of the David S. Lewis Jr. Chair, and Executive Director of the Strategic Energy Institute at Georgia Tech. He's also the author of 4 books on the physics of combustion in gas turbine engines, as well as a member of the governing or advisory boards for the Oak Ridge National Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, and National Renewable Energy Lab, among others. Tim joins me to talk about the grid, the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan-infrastructure-law on renewable power and electrification of the economy, and how long fossil fuels will stay in the energy mix. Welcome to the show, Tim. How are you doing today?
Good. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. You know, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, both passed and signed into law last year, are the biggest investments in U.S. infrastructure and industrial transformation in more than a generation. You told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution the IRA is working. What signals in the economy make you say that?
Yeah, it's actually an exciting time to be in Georgia and to be in the Southeast. Because sort of the point of the spear of a lot of the developments of these bills are happening in the region. And we're just seeing so much activity in terms of companies locating major clean tech manufacturing facilities here. Many of those moves being stimulated by the IIJA and IRA. For example, Hanwha Q-Cells, going to be the largest solar manufacturing facility in the United States. And where those tax credits made a really big effect. A lot of battery manufacturing, battery recycling, and so forth. Hydrogen, Plug Power, their hydrogen, green hydrogen manufacturing. So a lot of things are directly benefiting from the different types of stimuluses that are in those bills.
But what are the most important elements of that stimulus, both in the IRA and in the BIL?
Yeah, the stimulus is really interesting because it's there's really no sticks and it's all carrots. There's a lot of different kinds of carrots. There's the carrots are for domestic manufacturing. The carrots are for domestically sourced minerals. Right. The carrots are for different types of credits. For example, there's up to a $3 production tax credit for making green hydrogen. There is a significant enhancement in tax credits for capturing and storing hydrogen. For example, there's some of these numbers might sound a little esoteric for those who don't work in the industry, but there's a very large tax credit for what's called direct air capture, which is pulling CO2 out of the air, $180 a ton. And then there's a lot of different types of grants and programs for states to build out electric vehicle charging networks, to enhance the resilience and security of the grid, and so forth.
Well, the distinction between sticks and carrots is really important because a lot of the times when we talk about our legislation, it's in terms of the government's telling us what we can't do. But what we're really doing is setting up a lot of incentives for where we want to be. Do you think that the BIL and the IRA in particular have a clear definition of where we want to be, something that industry and policymakers are aligned around and on the way towards, or is all the political debate still going?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, and if you look at how the European Union is doing this relative to the U.S., there's political realities and there's just basic economics. And I'm an engineer, not an economist, but I think from everything I've heard, probably the most efficient way to reduce our carbon intensity is with a carbon tax. which is a political non-starter, at least right now in the United States. Whereas the EU, that's a path we're taking. But given that reality, and given just the politics of the situation, I think putting in this situation with a lot of different types of carrots, which are essentially carrots leading the donkey, so to speak, in that same general direction. I think it's going to put us in the right direction. I think the larger philosophical question is whether it's the least cost way to get there is to use sticks rather than, say, a carbon tax.
Well, now, when we talk about the grid and the evolution of the grid, a lot of the times the debate is over whether or not renewables, which are not consistently productive, but lumpy, is sufficient. So do you see at this point companies really taking full advantage of the tax incentives and other credits that we're talking about to start to invest in grid resilience?
Yeah, so there's a couple issues here, and I think it's really important to talk about timelines as well, because some of these issues around using what we call non-dispatchable generation sources. So in other words, a non-dispatchable source would be a source where it does what it's going to do, and then you can't tell it, as opposed to a gas plant or a nuclear plant or a hydro plant where you can turn it up and down. Mm-hmm. And so today, wind, let's say, is 10% of sort of average U.S. electricity, solar 3%. The numbers are starting to become significant, and in certain grids, like in ERCOT, which is the Texas grid, some days it actually hits 50%. But I would say on average, it's to the point where it's still the lowest levelized cost of electricity source on the market. But what's going to happen now is as these penetration rates go up, as we start to get to 50%, 60%, 70%, that non-dispatchability is you're going to have other things to support you and back you up, such as energy storage. And I think the other, when we talk about energy storage, there's energy storage over a second, over an hour, over a day, over a week, and over months. And all of these are different challenges and different types of technologies. And so I think certainly renewable electricity in the near term is going to continue being the lowest cost way to decarbonize our system, recognizing that probably, let's say post 2030, we're going to really, really need to start thinking about other ways of filling in the peaks and the valleys.
I got to spend a lot of time on the grid back in the Y2K days, because I was actually covering the Y2K bug, and it's extraordinary how complex this thing is. But and the language you just used, non-dispatchable, for instance, it's one for most of us, and the timeframes of the balance on the network on the grid is really interesting, from minutes to hours. But let me ask you to put it this way. If you were to sit down with a third grader, how would you describe to them how their world will change because of the changes in the grid by their 30th birthday?
I would say, today our electric power plants are large, very concentrated facilities that in which you drive by, you see them, but they're just super concentrated. They're just not.
They sit still. They sit still. You don't see anything happening.
What's going to happen with as we get these massive expansions of wind and solar is it's going to be ubiquitous. In some cases, like my wife is from Eastern Washington, and just watching the geography of this transformation in Eastern Washington, every ridgetop now is covered with these wind farms. So it's just fundamentally changed. It's in your face. And the same thing with these large scale solar farms. California has now put in that every new home that's built has to have solar on the roof. And so just the sources of electric power generation they're just geographically going to be everywhere.
Well, and that's really the interesting thing, is that generation is, the sun pours so much energy on us every day, and we have just not used it. Now we're going to be using it. Are we actually entering an era of energy abundance, one in which the balance on the grid becomes almost a trivial problem because we always are generating in one way or another, in addition to all the battery storage? How do you see that evolving? And are there particularly big challenges in front of us?
I'm there are people who say that, they're too cheap to meter, that people talked about that.
That never happens.
Well,
that never happens.
It's not going to happen. And so an era of energy abundance, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of nuance because I think when there's a lot of wind blowing and when it's the sun is fully out, I mean, potentially you're looking at dealing with a lot in overabundance, and we're already seeing this already in the United States where there's this word curtailment, where wind farms are, they're basically having to rotate out of the wind so that they can't produce as much power as they otherwise could because the grid has no place to put them.
Right.
And so the other thing that's going to really be interesting is today, the electric grid is a just-in-time system, is that literally the most complex machine in the world, the electric grid, is the supply and the demand of electricity are essentially matching every second. I mean, and there is just simply no other commodity that does that. I mean, imagine, when you go to the grocery store and you buy bread, imagine that the bread you're buying, that very instant that you're picking that piece of loaf up, that bread is being, the wheat is growing and all that supply chain has happened to deliver that piece of bread for you right there, or blueberries. It's phenomenal what's happening with the grid right now, which makes it really challenging. But what's going to happen with the grid is that as we, because of the need for storage and to level out the peaks in the valleys, the grid is going to start looking a little bit more like buying bread at Kroger or something like that, where hey, they made it a week ago and they're storing it and you're getting it now.
So that's really interesting, thinking about it in terms of the concurrency of all the things currently going on. One of the things I was struck by 25 years ago was the fact that it is literally physically controlled. There's switches, manual switches. Are we moving past that to digital controls so that this can be just managed remotely? And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, things are digitalizing very rapidly. Every substation, is connected via telecom. So there is a lot of work is going on just in the general area of power electronics. By the way, if I could just add one thing, a comment that you had asked me earlier around, barriers to growth of wind.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
In tax credits, I think it's really important to emphasize transmission and distribution lines. Is that the biggest barrier to growth, let's say, of wind today, is not access to tax credits. It's having the ability to build the high power lines to move wind from where it's produced to where it's needed. I mean, one of the things about wind is that it tends to be windiest in places that are a little bit more remote. If you just look at maps of the United States where there's lots of wind resources, these tend to be in the Great Plains, much more loosely populated. And so that is, The Economist magazine this week, the cover article is, hug a pylon, not a tree, and basically saying, we really need to start embracing build out of pylons, which are the big support structures for transmission lines.
Well, the throughways, when we first built the grid, frankly, the most of the United States wasn't that deeply settled, and now it is fully owned or owned by the federal government out here in the West. Because, in fact, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Washington and know exactly what you're talking. It's changed totally over the last 40 years. But do we need to exercise the right of eminent domain to just put those long distribution lines in place? How do we resolve that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question at hand. And I mean, it's a really complicated, democracy is a wonderful institution, and we have to figure out how to do this, because essentially what these high voltage long transmission lines do is that the benefits, there are almost no benefits to the vast majority of people that are affected by them. Directly. And that right away creates a huge political problem, where you have a very concentrated set of beneficiaries and a broadly distributed set of people who get the downside. And the other problem is just overlap. There's federal jurisdiction, there's state jurisdiction, there's local jurisdiction. And I'm not going to say that I have anywhere close to the expertise of just understanding just the patchwork of jurisdictions and what we can and can't do with eminent domain. But frankly, this is the number one problem with growth of renewable energy in the United States today.
Well, the other big issue is the necessary innovations in battery storage and generations, especially small scale generation, which could plug in a lot of the balance issues that we're going to have locally. Do you see enough progress in the science? I mean, generally people tell me, we have all of the basic science to do this. Do you feel that's true? And do you feel that it's being applied as an engineer to solve the problem correctly?
Yeah, I mean, battery, and so I think it's important. Let me just reemphasize another point: is that when we talk about energy storage, batteries are one piece, but not the only piece. Because
Right.
what batteries do is they level the hills and the valleys over hours and maybe days.
Mhm.
But they start to become less effective of a solution when you're talking about weeks and seasonal storage. But I would say battery costs have dropped dramatically. There's a lot of energy storage a lot of battery energy storage that's going on. A lot of companies, both new and large existing companies, are building big businesses out of building out batteries. What's the problem? It's just cost, right? I mean, it's essentially it's a shadow cost of building in non-dispatchable energy. Is that hey, solar and wind sounds really cheap, and it is, but again, but then you also have to put in these battery systems,
Right.
which essentially increase the cost.
What about the idea, in addition to batteries, we could store energy in forms of fuel like hydrogen? Do you see that playing an important role as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so in where hydrogen or other types of is really, it's not a source of energy. It's really a carrier. I like to think of hydrogen as a lot like electricity. It's just a way of moving energy around, but it's also easier to store. And so where hydrogen starts to become important is when we really, again, hydrogen is not the least cost way to do what we need to do over the next 5 years. But as we start to get really significant amounts of non-dispatchable renewables on the grid, and we really need to start moving energy around the country, and as we need to start moving it around, let's say between when you're producing a lot this month and you need it next month, that's when things like fuels, particularly hydrogen, really start to make sense.
Well, and hydrogen is a very electricity-intensive process to make.
It is.
This abundance that we were talking about before is really basically contextual. We can generate a whole lot of energy potentially where it can't be delivered very easily, but could be converted to hydrogen, and that then becomes a store. So that's not the grid we have today.
No, it's not.
Do we know how to manage this?
Yeah, it's not the grid. It's not the grid we have today. But the nice thing about it is we have a very large, well-developed natural gas pipeline system. A lot of those right-of-ways are already developed. There's some interesting pilots that are happening. There's some in England. In fact, Minnesota is doing it. California is doing it, where they're starting to inject hydrogen into the pipeline, and in essence, using the pipeline as a massive battery, a massive energy storage vehicle, but also as a really, really concentrated way of moving energy. There's been some studies that if you need to move a unit amount of energy, moving it in the form of a fuel versus moving it in the form of electricity, it's going to cost you about 10 times less to build out the energy transport systems if you want to move a fuel. But to your point, you got to, if in this world you're using electricity to make that fuel, and so there's the cost. There's issues associated with the cost of production, the issues associated with transportation and utilization.
Lots to manage. This is a great conversation. I want to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back.
Okay.
We're back. Let's continue the conversation with Dr. Tim Lieuwen. He is the executive director of the Strategic Energy Institute at Georgia Tech, and we're talking about the evolution, which is going to be complex, of the electric grid. Now, the Energy Information Agency reports that CO2 emissions from electricity generations actually peaked back in the aughts and now contribute fewer greenhouse gas emissions than the transportation sector, which is progress. When do you think that the natural gas peaker plants will really be relegated to purely emergency use as a last resort backup, rather than being an integral part of the grid and still emitting a lot of CO2?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in a larger question is just what will be the role of fossil fuels in our net zero? If assuming someday forward, let's say 2050, there's a lot of people pointing that direction, where we get to net zero, and there's a question of what's the role of fossil fuels. And I think there's a couple different dimensions to that angle. And so there's a lot of people putting together these models of the U.S. energy system, and people always say all models are wrong, but some are useful. And what these models do is they allow you a little bit of directional guidance in terms of, okay, if we want to get to net zero, what's the least cost way to get there? And I think if you look at anyone's model, if you don't constrain the model, but you just say, what's the least cost way to get there? All of them have the fossil fuels declining in use, but not going to zero. A typical number would be about 20% of our energy in a net zero society will be sourced from fossil fuels. 20%. And so in essence, what it's saying is it's cheaper to use some fossil fuels and then have carbon capture or direct air capture than to have 100% of our energy supplied by renewables and then dealing with just the backups and the resiliency and the energy storage issues.
So we're back to local context. Abundance and net zero are related in this sense. Where you are might not be net zero, but collectively the entire grid could be net zero.
Yep.
So a lot of people think in terms of fossil fuels as an absolute. We either have it or we don't. But you're describing an environment in which 20% of our generation still might be coming from them. What role will they be playing that produces that emissions?
Yeah, and I mean it's a great question. I think when I mentioned that 20%, that's basically saying what's the least cost way to get there. It's not thinking about there's going to be a lot of political issues that because jobs are going to be moving around and there's going to be some people who benefit and some who don't. It's going to change that number. There's a lot of people. Fossil fuels bring out a lot of strong opinions. A lot of people are like, we don't want a future with fossil fuels. And so there's going to be that piece, and that's all going to go into the political hopper, and the sausage is going to get made. But what sort of, if you want to just say what's the least cost path to our country, really what it comes down to is that there's a combination. There's first of all some sectors that just really like to use a fuel, and the number one sector for that is aviation. Large long haul aircraft. It's going to be really hard to see a future where they're not using a fuel. But then the other one is that if you think about resilience, is the fact that the grid, we're so used to a grid that is 99.9999% of the time on. We get irritated when twice a year we lose our power for a few months. So if you start thinking about what does it take for the grid not to work on average, not to work most of the time, but for the grid to work 99.9999% of the time, you have to have firm dispatchable power. Mm-hmm. And some of that we have with hydro, some of that we have with nuclear, but that's also kind of where these models are predicting we're gonna need fossil is for that role.
So the other 80% of generation will be renewable. Do you think we can get to that level of renewable generation by 2040, let's say? Where are we in terms of our ability to get to net zero?
Yeah,
which is fuzzy.
Yeah, technically, no reason whatsoever that we can't get there. It's 100% politics. It's 100%, and I don't mean politics in a negative way, but it's just the fact of people looking out. Enlightened self-interest is that everyone wants jobs for their family and things like that. And and then the other issue is just the NIMBY, the not in my backyard. And I mentioned earlier how electric power transmission lines are a particularly complicated political problem because the vast majority of people affected by power lines don't necessarily benefit from them. And so really our ability to site power, high voltage power lines is going to be a critical choke point. If we can solve that problem, we're going to be well on our way.
Politics and money. It's all
politics
about
and money. Yep.
So do you see in the IRA and the BIL investments in retraining to address the problem of moving people from the fossil fuel industry to the renewable industry, or helping them move into other jobs if their jobs are retired?
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of work that's being done and dollars that are being provided for community engagement, really trying to proactively engage communities ahead of time. So rather than having something foisted upon them, like a hydrogen production plant or a transmission line going by, but to really have them be part of the solution. You see a lot of programs in that. You see a lot of programs around retraining, workforce development. There's a lot of interest as well in making sure that the benefits of decarbonization are uniformly affect all Americans positively. And so you'll see a lot of interest in particularly making sure that this transition benefits lower income people as well. So there's lots of programs, state programs, things that universities like myself are involved in, things around technical colleges, things around just the community colleges and so forth.
Well, politics is the art of spreading around the costs and the benefits. So
that's right. Yep,
Well,
exactly.
I want to take a specific example, an issue a lot of people have talked about, which is what happened in Texas during the 2021 snowstorm and ice event. 4.5 million homes lost power. Now, a lot of prominent voices said renewables were at fault. What happened in Texas during that event?
That's a loaded question, a politically loaded question. I mean, so just a couple
You're an
facts.
engineer. Give me the engineers.
That's right. I'll give you that. So you go to the EIA website and you can download sort of the energy sources in Texas over those days. And essentially so everyone's right and everyone's wrong, I guess, in terms of what happened in Texas. But basically wind plummeted. If you look at wind power, it just fell like a rock. And so all of a sudden, all this wind power was simply not available. Well, what made up for wind was natural gas. So natural gas power production goes way up. But natural gas, which is supposed to be a dispatchable resource, you're supposed to say, give me this much power and it'll give you that much power. It turned out it wasn't able to go up enough. And that was due to power plants freezing, wells freezing, and things like that. And so in one sense, natural gas was Texas's savior, because if the gas plants hadn't been able to really ramp up their power, a lot more people would have been cold. On the other hand, natural gas was not a dispatchable resource, which was what it was supposed to be. In my opinion, what the problem with Texas is that it's what we call an energy-only market. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get too fancy, but just the idea is power producers get paid for the power they put on the grid. And the idea of Texas was, hey, if there's not enough power, price is going to go up, and that's going to incentivize people to put in more capacity. But I mean, if you are an investor and you're trying to make investments, it's a tough business to go into something for, really, really low probability events. Like, oh, what if it gets really, really cold once every 10 years? Okay, I can maybe make up the money by power prices spiking, but I think I'll just make my money for the other 999 days.
Well, Enron showed us exactly how hard that is.
Yeah. And, like you look at other markets, we have what are called capacity markets, where people get paid. Mm-hmm. Some people get paid for putting power on the grid, but other people get paid for actually having power that they could put on the grid if they need to.
Right.
And probably Texas is going to move in that direction.
Well, what policies should Texas or any state put in place to incentivize utilities to improve their resilience?
Well, I think what we've seen is that these energy-only markets are frankly a disaster. I mean, because people are getting 50,000, 100,000. Okay, so let's assume even the market can solve this problem with an energy-only market. But what it means is that when there's scarcity, you're going to get $100,000 power bill for keeping your home warm over a week. That just raises this massive political storm. I think it's much better to value the capacity as well. That even if people aren't putting power on the grid, the power that they could put on the grid, giving some value to that, which is what some other markets do.
So let me ask you about a current debate. It's in New York State, and they're debating what they call the New York State Build Public Renewables Act. And as I read this legislation, it's a top-down approach to infrastructure in which the state owns the grid, but the distributed nature of the renewable generation suggests that homes and businesses will be contributing to the grid in the role you were just talking about. There's capacity sitting out there. Are there any existing models for public ownership or regulation of private utilities that are prepared for this new reality of a distributed grid? What should we be thinking about in terms of structuring either public or private ownership to account for the dual role that everyone plays now as both consumer and producer?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of experiments that are going on, and I would say globally. I mean, there's a lot of experiments going on in the United States. There's a lot of experiments going on globally. And just the issues of I'm calling from Georgia, where we have a vertically integrated utility that owns both the generation source as well as the transmission assets and the distribution assets, and then you have other markets where that's distributed around. I would say I think it's too early to say what the best way to manage this is because each one of these different types of experiments that are going on have different pros and cons. I think some of these more market-based approaches have some real potential ability to use competition to drive down costs. But then you run into issues like you have with Texas, where who ultimately owns resilience and reliability? And really, to me, that's going to be the issue. Who will ultimately, where does the buck stop when the grid goes down? Whose problem is it? Who gets laid off?
Well,
Who gets fired? Yeah.
Not just the political, but the practical problem in that casting ownership in a particular sense is our ownership concepts are pretty dated.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a resource and a set of costs associated with the resource that are now being differently distributed. It doesn't feel like we have the politics to do this because we're using politics primarily to block the other side rather than to collectively figure out what we're going to do together.
Yeah, and I'd say the other issue beyond there certainly are political issues, but I think it also goes to, again, where the costs are being distributed. Like, for example, if you look at some of the net metering, there's a lot of different things around net metering, which is basically if you put some solar panels on your roof, hey, if you want to sell it back to the grid, what price should you get? And there's a lot of different numbers and some controversy in some states like Arizona have really dialed those back. But what it ultimately goes back to is the value of that power that you're providing, and because essentially what the homeowner or whoever's putting on the grid will argue for a higher value because they're saying, hey, I should get paid for the electrons that I'm putting on the grid. Whereas maybe the utility might say, well, but when you don't put it on the grid, I have to make it up. So It's still my problem. And I still have to maintain the wires.
A shared responsibility and shared obligation.
Yeah, and so I'd say that's the issue too. Beyond politics, it's just how do you appropriately apportion those costs and benefits of this grid? Where there's a lot of things that have to happen.
In a sense, that's the question we started with, but it is the question we're living with. And
yep.
So I want to turn quickly to something you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is aviation fuel. You work on turbines and combustion. What form of propulsion do you think will dominate aircraft design in the 2040s? Is it going to be hydrogen, biofuels, or are we still going to be burning fossil fuels?
So I think the answer depends on the size of the aircraft. I think smaller aircraft, particularly, let's take UAVs. They're going to be all electric. I think there's going to be good reasons for them to be all electric, or potentially maybe hydrogen. I think maybe even small commuter aircraft potentially could go electric. There's all electric has some, and I say this as a person who grew up working on cars, and I love reciprocating engines, but all electric has some significant benefits in terms of total cost of ownership. There's just a lot less moving parts, a lot less stuff to break. Pistons not going up and down, just causes durability issues. So total cost of ownership benefits are a huge driver for electrification. But on the other hand, there's nothing like a gas turbine for producing a lot of power in a very dense way, which is why larger aircraft, I think, are going to be powered by probably, in fact, I'll say more than probably, I'll put my money on this, liquid fuels powered by gas turbines. One caveat, though, you said fossil fuels. I would say it's not necessarily clear that they'll be fossil fuels. They will be a liquid. They will be a liquid fuel. They will look like today's fossil fuels, but they could be 100% renewable. What we call sustainable aviation fuels, SAF.
That's encouraging to hear. And I want to thank you for spending time with us today. And one last question. If you had a recommendation for a listener today, one thing they can do to accelerate the move to renewable energy, whether it's on their part or their community's part, what action do you recommend they take?
Well, I think I'll just say the near-term thing is we have to have ways of getting renewable energy into the market. And the biggest problem that we're having is build out of transmission, electric power lines. So just being much more open to expansion of transmission and distribution for electricity.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I appreciate your time today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Dr. Tim Lieuwen. He is the executive director of the Strategic Energy Institute at Georgia Tech. And we covered a lot of ground here, so let's summarize the takeaways with a few thoughts. Unlike many laws, the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan-infrastructure-law are relying primarily on incentives, not restrictions on citizens or companies' ability to make choices. The political contests over our national strategy to reach net zero emissions by the late 2040s or earlier is fueled by, and that pun is intended, existing industries fighting to retain their position in the energy generation market. But the oil and gas industry are also well subsidized to the tune of many dollars per gallon of gas delivered. So in that sense, the renewables incentives in the IRA and BIL are, at most, a leveling of the playing field. So it's up to us as consumers to ask for what we want, renewables, not oil and gas, in order to lower our home or business's environmental impact. It's the quintessential American choice in that sense. But Tim also argued that fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, will remain in service for to a limited degree. The distribution of energy generation is increasing. Almost any surface or hilltop can be utilized to make electricity, while the ability to distribute all that newly accessible power is unevenly available because we need to build more long electric line corridors to move power around, to dispatch it, as Tim said. The debate over the value of a kilowatt hour of energy will be highly local, and the context of where and how power is generated and stored will define the political and economic struggles for dominance on the grid. The cost of a kilowatt hour is going to vary from place to place, just like it always has, but based on different factors. Renewables seem inevitable, but face ongoing political and economic pressure, and the end of the fossil fuel subsidies may be the only way to break the logjam. As I said in the introduction, the future will be exciting and terrifying all at once as we continue to explore how we're going to reshape our grid. So we'll be continuing to track this on the show. Trust me. Would you take a moment to share this podcast or any of the other more than 390 interviews we've produced on sustainability in a year? I'd certainly appreciate it. If you'd take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, that would help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that spread more ideas so we can all create less waste. Tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of their other fine purveyors of podcast goodness that they prefer. Thank you so much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth 911. We will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.